The most encircled and threatened country is the USSR. It is the one that is targeted with all these missiles. There is, ladies and gentlemen, those missiles are not the result of an arms race. I maintain that there is no arms race, and there never has been. As you know, the model of a race is the two proponents moving, each more furiously ahead of the other, trying to put as much space to get to some goal. That model doesn't explain arms escalation. What we have had, rather, has been an arms chase, with one side, the U.S., unilaterally escalating each time, and the other side, the Soviet Union, playing catch-up, often with a 2 to 7 year lag in the particular weapon system. That was true of the A-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, the long-range bomber, submarine-launched missiles, the MIRVs, the multiple warheads, the ICBMs, tactical nuclear weapons, solid-fuel rockets, and now even today with the MX, the cruise, the Pershing, and the neutron bomb, the race model doesn't explain it. It's a chase. As the Soviets said just several years ago, don't build a neutron bomb. If you build it, then we will have to build it. Don't build the MX. If you do that, we will escalate on our ICBM. That's hardly a race. That's more of a chase. The other side, asking that this escalation not take place, and then when the escalation does, it reluctantly moves on. Reluctantly, I say, because the arms race has had a tremendous damaging effect on the Soviet economy. Every time they have to build another tank, that's one less subway car for their subways. In the USSR, any city that reaches 1 million people gets a new subway built in it. Every new missile means that much less quality consumer goods. It also, by the way, has the same drain on our country, but it's not as evident given the kind of country it is. The arms race here, the defense spending is, of course, an enormous shot in the arm to the owning class in terms of profits, guaranteed cost overruns, fat contracts, so forth. The Soviet Union has a capital shortage, unlike the U.S., which has a capital surplus, and so therefore this deprivation. The Soviet Union has a labor shortage, unlike the U.S., where there are 20 million people underemployed. It has a smaller industrial base, so to match us, that's a greater drain on it. It has scientists who would prefer working in the civilian sector because their work in the military sector remains anonymous. Managers who would have management jobs in the civilian sector. In short, it has a number of rational reasons why it would like to diminish the arms race. As Gorbachev has said again and again, we have a lot of building in our own country. We have never had a normal year in our history. We have had foreign invasion, revolution, invasion again, forced collectivization, et cetera, armaments race, and we would like to have some normal years. So I would argue that Soviet escalations have been mostly reactive and defensive to U.S. escalations. This is true also if you look at the Soviet Navy. It has, until very recently, no aircraft carriers for attack and amphibian actions. It now has one. It's had a few mini carriers. The Soviet fleet is built almost entirely to tracking the U.S. fleet. Soviet interest in disarmament is reflected in the proposals that they have made. You could say, well, words are cheap, I want to see actions. First of all, words aren't cheap. Words count too. What a nation says is reflective of what it's doing. But actual moves also have been taken. For instance, one, the Soviets proposed the eventual disbanding of NATO and Warsaw Pact armies. A proposal, gradual, mutual de-escalation, step by step on each side. One, two, that, down like that. The U.S. turned down that proposal, would not even study it. The Soviets proposed, in the last 4 years, nuclear-free Europe, reducing their medium-range SS-20s and all those to match the 162 which France and Great Britain had. That was a proposal made 3 years ago. It's a proposal which Gorbachev has brought forth again. It's one which Reagan has ignored, but simply to quote for zero sum, and without the two reasonable stipulations which Moscow has asked for, namely that if we get rid of all our missiles both sides, we also guarantee that you don't transfer any of your existing missiles in Europe to the French or British, and the French and British begin to get rid of their missiles. Or at least at this stage, they freeze them. And in fact, the French and British now are increasing their number of intermediate range missiles. And remember, intermediate range missiles in the West, cruise and Pershing missiles in Western Europe, are not intermediate range. They can reach Soviet soil, so they are strategic. They can hit Soviet ICBMs. Soviet SS-20s are nasty weapons indeed, but they cannot reach the United States. They cannot knock out any MXs or ICBMs. They are not first strike potentials. Another thing to remember, cruise and Pershing missiles that are now in Europe have a 7-minute strike time. That's the end of deterrence. And this is why Gorbachev and the Russians are beside themselves about the cruise and Pershing. This is why they walked out of Geneva in 1983, because Reagan refused to negotiate on the cruise and Pershing. This allows Reagan to turn around and say, we went to Geneva, but they walked out, as he's going to do now with this latest cancellation. What you do is you shove a person away, you act hostile toward them, they get up and they say, well, you obviously don't want to negotiate, they walk out, and then you turn to people who say, you see, they don't want to reach an agreement. If it takes me a half hour to get my missiles over and kill you, and you a half hour to kill me, then in that half hour after I let mine go, you know they're coming. And you let yours go at me. That is a deterrent to me. However, if I can reduce the striking time to 7 minutes, and they're so low and fast, and your radar can only pick them up in the last 2 minutes, I now have a first strike capacity on you. You no longer have deterrence. I no longer can fear your missiles, because my missiles are targeting yours. And I'll knock out all of your missiles, and then I'll have a second strike capacity to hit you. You'll have a feeble retaliatory strike. Your feeble retaliatory strike, however, will be blocked out by my Star Wars. Is that what Star Wars is all about? You see, the criticisms about Star Wars are largely irrelevant in that area. People have said, scientists have said, it's a ridiculous project. It's going to have to work the first time and work perfectly. Only if the Soviets launch their 10,000 missiles at us in a fit of peeve one day, they say, let's destroy the world, and they send the missiles at us, only then will Star Wars have to work perfectly. But if the function of Star Wars is to be a shield against a feeble retaliatory strike of the Soviets after a first strike by the U.S., then Star Wars becomes much more effective. And Ronald Reagan himself let the cat out of the bag last year when he said, it doesn't have to work perfectly. And he speaks and all, they've got him away from the platform and all that. Because they explained it to him just that morning at breakfast. And it is that if I can only block out 90% of 10,000 missiles, I'll be destroyed by 1,000 missiles. But if all the Ruskies have left are 60 or 70 missiles, and I can block out 90% of those, then only 7 or 8 will hit us. And that is called acceptable collateral damage. How do you like that for 1984? 20 million, anywhere from, they estimate from 4 to 20 million. Acceptable collateral damage. But we would have won one for the Gipper, eh? There are nuts in the Pentagon who think like this, ladies and gentlemen. They get big fat military pensions too, and they get big fat salaries, and they got big boards all lit up. They think like that all the time. But short of starting a nuclear war, the grand design is to have a first strike capacity that so puts the Soviets under the gun again that we'll be back to 1947, when we could brandish that weapon around, and they would have to retreat. They would have to concede. They would have to pull back in fear. We'd be back to 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy sat there and thought of a strike against the Soviet Union. And they realized that Khrushchev really had only 1, possibly 2 ICBMs that could reach the U.S., and it would only reach the northeast corner of the U.S. But they estimated that this might cause 1 million, 2 million casualties, and that would be politically unacceptable. And so they discarded any idea of a nuclear strike against the Soviets. That one missile may have saved our lives. So it's not true that the missiles just build up blindly on both sides. They're caught in this irrational race. That it's just something in man's nature for war. I loved those songs, but there was something about the politics in one of them that didn't ring right with me. That it's just people caught up in this meanness and killing for killing, and when are we going to reach our senses? That's not true. That's not the way it works. It's not something that comes in here. If it was something in our nature, why would they have to draft us? Why would they have to use press gangs and drag us in? Within the last 4 years, the Soviets called for the banning of weapons in outer space before the United Nations, a resolution that was voted 124 to 1. Who was the one? Not the U.S., Ronald Reagan. It wasn't the American people, right? It was that coterie that is misrepresenting us. All the opinion polls show that the American people didn't want weapons into outer space, at least back in those days before the Star Wars promo. 124 to 1 with one abstention. Do you know who the abstention was? No, it wasn't Israel. It was Margaret Thatcher. The Soviets have signed a no first use pledge, a pledge that we will not be the first to ever use nuclear weapons. And the only reason they signed that is because they cannot imagine any time when it would be in their interest ever to be the first to use nuclear weapons. They haven't ruled out the possible use of them, and they keep building too. That no first use pledge, the U.S. has refused to sign it. Well, so what? That means less hypocrisy, because when push comes to shove and the missiles are going to fly, they're going to fly, right? No. What nations say is an indication of their interests and their strategies to some degree. Sometimes there's lies and deception. The U.S. cannot sign a no first use pledge because they have threatened, every administration has threatened the use of nuclear weapons. It's part of U.S. foreign policy. That's what Star Wars, that's what First Strike, that's what Cruise and Pershings are. It's to gain dominance again over the socialist countries, over the third world, by having nuclear superiority. The U.S. threatened first use and thought of using nuclear weapons at Quezon during the Korean War. Eisenhower did. Nixon thought of using nuclear weapons at what was that battle? During the Tet Offensive, but the Eisenhower administration not only deliberated using them, but actually decided to at Dien Bien Phu, and said yes, and offered nuclear weapons to the French. Said, do you want to use some of these tactical nuclear weapons at Dien Bien Phu? And the French refused. They took the defeat instead. So they were quite ready to use them then. And any number of occasions, by the way, the use of nuclear weapons, the Kennedy administration and the Cuban Missile Crisis seriously considered the use of nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union, as I mentioned before. So it is a part of policy. It is one of the weapons that are to be used to maintain imperial hegemony, to keep history from happening, to keep people under the gun. So if they signed a no first pledge, they could no longer threaten using the weapons. It would show them to be hypocrites and liars. They signed the pledge, and here they are threatening to use the weapon. And if they signed the pledge and threatened to use the weapon, this would undercut the credibility of the use of the weapon. Or if they signed the no first pledge, this would undercut the credibility of the threat of nuclear weapons. And the value of those weapons is a threat. And by the way, it may not be that the U.S. is ready to destroy the USSR. Their ultimate plan is really to get such a superiority with Star Wars, Cruise, Pershing, and all that, forward attack, planes and submarines and everything else, that they will just be able to dictate terms, as I was saying. And first use pledge would certainly not fit into that scheme of things at all. Therefore, the policies are not really totally symmetrical between Moscow and Washington. The Soviet Union, this is one of the best kept secrets in the United States. The Supreme Soviet in February of 1981 voted unanimously to endorse a mutual, bilateral, verifiable nuclear freeze that was virtually identical to the ones which were passed in those 20 Vermont townships and voted in 9 states and endorsed in hundreds of towns and cities in America. And its wording was almost word for word the same pledged. The Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that same month voted unanimously to endorse a nuclear freeze. The U.S. has, in fact, ignored any proposal for nuclear freeze despite a massive movement involving millions of people in this country, probably the biggest mass movement in such a short time in our history was the nuclear freeze movement. And the sheer numbers of people who signed up, who marched, who demonstrated, who wrote letters, who pledged for nuclear freeze, it was a mass movement. And the Reagan administration simply ignored the whole thing. Didn't exist. Wouldn't hear of it, wouldn't consider it. It didn't fit into their very rational plans of a different kind of world. The Soviet Union has called for the reduction of ICBMs. The Reagan administration refused to negotiate it, or totally ignored that offer in 1982, and ignored it again when more dramatically Gorbachev came up and said, let's not negotiate it, but let me give you numbers. A 50% cut, both of us, right off the top, let's start. With total on-site inspection, by the way, another change in Soviet policy. Total, complete on-site inspection under any conditions you want. Come on in, look anywhere you want about this sort of thing. And the U.S., again, won't take yes for an answer. Ronald Reagan won't. The Soviet Union had a unilateral and observed and is still observing unilateral moratorium on anti-satellite weapon testing. The Soviet Union called for last year cuts in conventional forces, again, NATO and Warsaw. The Soviet Union unilaterally observed a moratorium on underground nuclear testing and has called for a total ban of all nuclear testing, because Gorbachev knows that if you stop nuclear testing, that's the end of the development of nuclear weapons. You can't develop nuclear weapons if you can't test anymore. And Reagan knows that also, and so he's ignored the proposal. The Soviets unilaterally, last year, as you know, said we will not test for the rest of this year. And the Reagan administration said, oh, that's because they do all their testing early in the year, and they've got them all done already, but we still have a few tests. Okay, maybe that's it. So do all your tests, catch up, and when it comes December 31st, you say to them, we're going to observe it too. Didn't do that. January 1st came, and Gorbachev said, we will extend that moratorium several more months. And the U.S. said, oh, they extended because they don't test in the cold months, January, February, March. They don't test then. Although they supposedly do all their testing in the early part of the year. I don't understand that one. And then when they extended the moratorium yet a bit further, the argument was, this is a propaganda ploy. They're trying to appeal to the American people. And we, in order to reach the ultimate point of getting rid of nuclear weapons, will have to continue testing right now. What was a masterful phrase of double think. I mean, that was an actual quote. Star Wars, besides being that defense, that first strike shield, people say, it's too expensive. What are you talking about? It's too expensive. That's one of its attractions. It's going to cost $1 trillion. It'll cost more than the entire New Deal WPA program and the Manhattan Project, which gave us the atomic bomb, and the Eisenhower Highway Project. Put all of them together, and the building of the railroads, put all of them together, they won't cost as much as Star Wars. $1 trillion is for the first stage. They think the first stage. That's what the boys like who have these defense contracts. That's what they love. They see dollar bills. Getting there is all the fun. Whether the system works or doesn't work, the expensiveness is the major attraction. It will violate the ABM treaty, and now we see even it violates the atmospheric testing treaty. What's wrong with that? Reagan has no loyalty to the ABM or the atmospheric testing. He's been wanting to violate them since he's been in office. Peace forces in the Soviet Union. By the way, there are massive peace forces. Millions of people marched. The Leningrad Peace Committee. There are photos of these people marching with these banners. No missiles east or west. And again, you should make a distinction between a country which supports and encourages a massive peace movement and a government like ours which derides it, red baits it, ignores it, or puts it down. Do you realize today the United States has a striking power, a deployment power, a force, a delivery power that's 1,000 times more powerful than anything Calvin Coolidge had? And you got a president that's 1,000 times nuttier than Calvin Coolidge, who would like to go in there, who wants to go in, and yet he hasn't? Well, what's held him back? The democratic forces. It's the same thing that kept Nixon from using nuclear weapons in Vietnam as the story came out when the Pentagon Papers were released, or not the Pentagon Papers, the White House tapes, where they were afraid of what the disruption and the reaction of the people in their own country.